Welcome back, peeps. My name is Chad Wills from Simple Cloudware, and today we're going to be adding the ability to call APIs from our Lambda project. Keep your head in the cloud. What is the point of going serverless? Well, there are two main factors that are driving this transition. One is cost. You can actually host your API for pennies a day, and there is no other way you could do such a thing. The second is scalability. Because this is in Lambda, AWS is going to auto-scale with the volume of traffic to your API. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is go and get the template that we're going to use to build AWS projects. So we can just go over here to set up AWS toolkit for Visual Studios, and they have a quite extensive tutorial on this, but we don't need that. We'll just go straight here and get our template, which is this Visual Studios Marketplace. And then we'll just download and install this. Alright. This might take a while depending on your download speed. So when this is finished, we just open this up and go through the installation process. And I picked up both versions of Visual Studios that I have on my machine. That's fine. I'm actually going to skip forward because this takes maybe 5 minutes to install. So once this is in, then we just push close. So from here, let's go and go over to the console and so sign up with your AWS credentials. And what we're going to do now is set up everything that we need to actually publish our project. And so we come into IAM, and then from here we go to groups, or policy, sorry. And we create a new policy, and we're just going to do this through JSON, and I'll include this JSON below in the comments. It took me a while to figure out all the pieces that we need to actually publish, but this is the set right here. You can either pause this and type this out, or you can go and get this out of the comments. And so here we'll just give this a recognizable name and then a brief description. And we're going to be using this for publishing. Everything else should be fine. So we can just go over here and create. And the next thing from here is we need to add a group. Let's put in the group name now, promotion access. You can call it whatever you like. And it's a whole bunch of different types of policies for this promotion. And so I have several of the different policies and just their names, so I'll search for them and then add them, and then we'll get a complete group going. So we added that. We've got AWS Lambda. Otherwise, it's kind of a nightmare to search through. We just filter it. And so here's our gateway. And our IAM full access, and our CloudFormation. And we want to make sure it's the CloudFormation that we actually created, which is a more limited set of access. Okay. I think that looks good. So create this group. So now that we have this, let's add our users to our group. So we just pick a particular username that indicates that we're going to be using this for promotion. And this is going to be programmatic access because it's going to be accessed out of Visual Studios. Next here. And then here is our group for this user to be added to. And we don't really need any tags. Great, so we can create the user. And then the one thing that we're going to need is this username, access key, and secret access key. And this is what we're going to use to configure Visual Studio Publish, so we're just going to set this aside for now. You could also download the CSV. Now I'm just going to make a copy of these. Alright, now let's bring up Visual Studios and create our first Lambda expression that we're going to use to publish. And let's create a new project. And there are several options here. We want to go for the serverless application. Alright. Just push next. You can call it whatever you'd like. Just going to go with the default here. And from here we want to select the ASP.NET Core Web API. That way we have something that we're familiar with, and we can actually use locally and in Lambda. Okay, so now that we have our project template created, let's follow our standard procedures of adding our folders and our configs, which are the first thing, of course, that are being used. It's kind of our standard operating procedure now to add our models, services, and put in our initial set of configurations. Okay, and then let's add the 4 models that we're going to use for this project. Here's our classic HTTP response model. And we're just going to type this stuff in here. And this is actually going to get our status code that comes back from the API call. And then I'm using a control period to actually get the using statement. We don't need this now. And this call actually returns call length, which we can use later on for analysis to see which calls may be slow or taking the longest. A little error here. We just need to fix the semicolon. Just a typo. All right. Model number 1. So this model, the simple Boolean response, this is what we're going to use to validate that we have connectivity, which is super important to begin there. So if you lose connectivity, you won't go looking in all the wrong places. So actually gives you the ability to make sure you're actually connected to the API. And in our simple response model, this is where we're going to capture the results that are returned from the response. Usually a set of JSON. And then our last one, of course, is to capture our token. And capturing the tokens usually take a little more effort because the naming convention most of the time is not standard. So we can use our JSON properties to bring in and map that non-standard naming convention to our internal models. And then I'm using a control period to bring in this using statement. All right. And this JSON property works also when you serialize the contents of this model back out. So if you needed to map to a convention or something as the model is exiting your API, you can use this in reverse. And the mapping does a pretty good job. If the word is the same, even if the capitalization is different, then it most of the time can figure it out. But here, of course, the word structure is different. All right, looks good. Alright, so let's get our configurations in there before we start our service. So our base URI is the same that it has been in all of our projects. If you'd like to get this particular set of code, there's a link in the description in which you can go and download it and follow along or see the end result. Alright, and there's our code. And and our secret, which we need to create our JWT token. Good. So now that we got the models and we got the configuration in, let's create our HTTP call. The first thing we want to do is bring in our configurations. And as we build this out, then we'll use this in multiple different types of calls. And creating a call from the Lambda is actually just the beginning of the use of this particular serverless structure. It's just a good demonstration. Always seems like I'm using the API or calling other APIs and using the HTTP as part of some of the other heavy lifting that I'm doing in code. It's a good place to start. Alright, so we're mapping these into our configurations. You can be really careful with these strings that you don't misspell them. Alright, so let's move on to our first function. And of course we're going to use our async await when making this call. And then we'll return our first model, our HTTP response model. And what we'll be passing into this is the particular endpoint and a key value pair list of parameters. This gives us quite a bit of flexibility with this particular call. And then we can set the parameters and then transform the results in the endpoints. And we're also setting the parameters to null, which if we don't need to pass parameters for a get call, then we can do a null check and skip that piece of code. And here's our response model. And now let's construct our URI. Oops, forgot to name it the URI. Let's go back and get that in there. Okay. And we know that there's going to be at least one parameter, query parameter. So we'll use our query helper to add that. And the query helper helps distinguish if it needs to be the first parameter with a question mark or any other parameters afterwards with the ampersand. It just makes the code cleaner. Now let's do a null check on the passed in parameters, and then use the query helper if there are additional ones. And we're just going to loop through that list. And something like a query helper is a natural fit to the key value pair. We have the key and the value. So let's put our actual call in a try-catch. That way if there's an issue, we can see what it is. And in a future video, we'll demonstrate how to log issues both for the client side, which is a limited set of information, and then for troubleshooting. But for now, we'll just throw the exception. So when we make calls out to another API, it's good to wrap them in a using statement which auto opens and closes the connection, which helps, especially at volume, with memory control. We don't want to leave these threads open. We want to close them as fast as possible. And once again, I used the control period to bring in the using statement. Alright, now we can configure this as a get. And then depending on what API you're using, it might need just the one header that tells it that we are accepting JSON, or there can be many formats here. JSON and XML are the two most common, and there might be additional headers that are needed to communicate with the particular API. Many of them pass in the token in the header. And then see that we are using our await. So we're going to await this call to return before continuing in code. Here also we're going to await the stream, the content stream to complete. Because we're going to be reading that stream async. And then we're just going to add the status. Perfect. All right, so that looks good. It's a kind of a classic HTTP call function. And so now let's actually use this to test our connectivity. All right, we're just going to come in here and add our parameters and our first get. Make sure to be in the class. Made that mistake a couple times. And here's our I configuration. Oops, corrected. Using the control period to bring in the using statement. And then we're going to create a constructor for the value controller so then we can tie in our configurations. Alright. And it's just a simple mapping. There we go. So now let's create our first get. And we'll start, of course, with the API test. So we're going to decorate our function with the HTTP GET and the route. And then I try to match the route, the function, and the actual endpoint as close as possible. This is going to be an async task. And we're just going to use the iAction result, which will give us the ability to use the OK for return things. And here the route name. Okay, so let's instantiate the processor. And we're going to do that by control period and then bringing in using statement. We're using this process. And now let's add our model. First time we're using it, so we'll need to bring that in also. And here's our await for our async await. And we're going to call this just using the API test without parameters. And when they have a default value, then you don't have to include it, which makes it nicer. And of course, let's add our config here. Okay, and now let's actually deserialize the string that is returned into our response model. JSON convert, the control period to bring that in. Deserialize, and then we're going to name our particular object. And this will be our content. So we're kind of hydrating the model now. And then we'll return that new object. Perfect. So let's put a breakpoint here and let's test out to make sure we have connectivity. Let's just run this. Okay, and remember that the path always starts with API, then the controller name, then the actual endpoint. So come in here, and now let's trace through here and make sure that we've gotten all of our configurations. All right, we're looking good. URL looks good. And we got an OK. So we're successfully making connections to the API. Nice. Here. So now let's expand our first call and actually get our JWT token. So we'll copy all of this work, switch our route and endpoint name and call name. Okay. And in this particular instance, we do have a parameter, which is going to be our secret. The same pattern and get the value. And then we're going to construct a key value pair list and one key value pair to go in it. Call this parameters. And now we're constructing the first param that goes in here. Before we add to the list, let's actually add the values for our parameter. And those are just added by putting them into the parens. So it's just key value. Alright. And now let's add this individual key value pair to our list. And then we add the list to our HTTP call. Okay, looks good. And now let's switch this simple response model to the token model so we can deserialize the string that returns. And then we can return the response. Alright, so let's fire this thing up. And remember, it's always API, then the first part of the name of the controller, then the endpoint. And let's actually go and set an API breakpoint here so we can see what happens. Okay. We're just going to rip through this code, make sure that it sets our key value pair. Okay, looks good. Let's make this call and loop through our parameters to add them to the URL. And make the call. Alright, that was a success. So bring the string back, deserialize it, and return it. And now we have an access token. Cool. So now that we have our access token, let's verify that the access token actually authorizes. So let's copy our token. I'm going to add one final step to make sure that we have full access to this API. Get off test. Then we're going to be making two calls here, so we can use some of this code that we've created for the first and the second call. And since we're using async await, we can just run through the call, wait to get our token back, and then use that token to actually make the auth test call. Okay, so here is the deserialization of the first auth test, and now we're going to create a parameter that has the token as part of the parameters, not the secret. So we'll just call this parameters token. Put this down here, and then we'll have this param token, and then we'll change the key value pair. This token, and then grab the deserialized token out of it. Access token, right there. Okay, so now that we have that, let's capture the result of this call. We'll be using the get auth test. We'll need to rename this result for the token. And then switch the parameters. And then when you're doing this sort of cut and paste of pre-existing code, be very careful on making sure that you've got everything switched out. I've created several issues for myself by not switching all the different things that I needed. So here's a response auth token, and then we're going to return that instead. We're going to be switching this model to our boolean, which is our test verify authorization. Okay. So it looks good. Set the endpoint and let's give this thing a test. Usually when there's this much code, it takes 1 or 2 tries to actually get through it all. So follow our pattern of API, first part of the controller name, and the endpoint name. Alright, so let's get through this and see if we've got everything configured appropriately. The first part is probably good because we've already run through it. Okay, looks good. Now let's see how this is transformed. Okay, looks like we're adding our token. We've got our parameters token going in. And now we're making the call with the token instead of the secret. Looks like it didn't find that endpoint. Okay, here's the issue. So we use getAuthTest, and I think the API is looking for just authTest. That's not a big deal, even though it's kind of breaking our pattern of just using the same kind of magic string for everything. Let's just fix that. Let's give it another shot. Feeling pretty confident now. Same pattern, API, controller, first part of its name. Okay, and you see now we just skipped forward by putting a new breakpoint there. Alright, auth test now. And we have it okay, so we're looking good. Look at that. Okay, response true. So now we have all 3 of our API calls working. So now let's publish this to AWS and do this serverlessly. So let's go back to our project, right click on the project itself and bring up the AWS, then type in the profile name, our access key. For whatever reason, this pop-up loses its ability to click on once you mouse away from it. So you can see that, but it's not that big of a deal because when you push cancel, it still has the information in it. So you just push cancel. And then click it again, and then fill in this secret access key. Cool. And the account number you don't need. So it should pick up everything that we configured. I usually try to stick with the same region. So stay in North Virginia. And then for the stack name, we've got to kind of hunt around to find one that's available. So we can try AWS Serverless 1. It's probably not available. We'll take a shot. And then I usually match the bucket as the same name. Okay, so looks like this bucket name is already used. So maybe we just use the tutorial name for it. And like I said, I try to match them. But you can call them whatever your naming convention is. There we go. And then just hit next. And then I retype the name of the bucket in here, and then should create the bucket. I set to false. And all of this should work, so let's just push publish. Okay, here we go. Looks good. And if you got this configured appropriately, then everything should work just fine. The common issues that you have in here is the actual IAM configuration of the policy group and user. So if you follow that specifically, this should work without an issue. I'm just gonna wait for it. Alright, creation complete. So here is our URL. Let's go and grab that and see if we can make all of these calls serverlessly. Okay. And remember our pattern of API, and then the controller name, and then the endpoint. Alright, so now we're making calls serverlessly. Congratulations, peeps! We have just added the ability to make API calls from our Lambda function project. This will give us the ability to expand out and create entire apps in AWS. If you like this video, please join the community by hitting the subscribe and notification, and give us a thumbs up so other people just like you can find this video. Keep your head in the cloud.